Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Here we have the Researching Race in Computer Science Education panel, demystifying key vocabulary and methods. So in computing education, we're often talking about broadening participation in computing. And when we do research in that space, it's not just about who's participating in our educational activities, but really centering issues of race in our research methods and our research questions. So we have 4 scholars here today to talk about case studies of the work that they've been doing. And then in doing that, are going to talk through some of the vocabulary that they use to try and make that seem a little less mystifying. So we'll start and turn it over to my colleague Neeral Shah from University of Washington, Seattle.
All right, thanks, Colleen. It's so good to be on this panel, and I'm glad we're able to still pull it off under these conditions and share all this research and knowledge with everybody. So I'm going to just start by just saying a little bit about who I am, my background. So I'm currently a STEM education researcher and also a teacher educator at the University of Washington. My focus has been looking at STEM classrooms, math classrooms, and now also computer science classrooms, physics classrooms, and so on. And I've been interested in how race and racism are playing out in everyday classroom interaction between teachers and students, but also students and students, and then what that means for students' opportunities to learn in STEM settings. I'm also a former high school math teacher, so I've taught everything from pre-algebra to calculus BC. And even before that, one of my undergraduate degrees is in computer science. So, you know, after that, I never thought I would be doing anything with computer science ever again after becoming a math teacher and then moving into the education research space. But it's funny how worlds collide, and kind of I find myself, you know, coming back to the computing world in a variety of ways in teaching and research. So I'd like to start just by sharing a little bit about two key ideas in the race literature that I think might help make thinking about educational research around race specifically, as opposed to culture, ethnicity, and other social markers, a little more tractable for all of you. So just starting with just the idea of race. So we typically think about these as a set of categories, and it's usually based on physical traits like skin color, hair type, and so on. But what we find historically is that these are really kinds of racial categories are very fluid, and the definitions about you know, who counts as being white, who counts as being black, and other racial markers, that's fluctuated over the course of time, and it's been a site of political and legal contestation, and that's pretty clear in the U.S. Legal record. But just kind of going back, I think one key idea to remember about race is that even though oftentimes today it feels like something that's just natural and we take for granted, the modern idea of race hasn't always existed, right? So if you go back to the 1500s in the context of colonization and just the European interest in coming to North America in particular, indigenous erasure and genocide, that's in the context of that, and then the context of slavery, that's really when the modern idea of race first emerged. Right, so Ibram Kendi, in his book Stand from the Beginning, which I recommend, kind of lays out some of this history and how, you know, he argues that racism actually came first, which is basically the pursuit of exploitation, domination for the purpose of accruing material interests, and then race came after that. Right, so race and those categories that we kind of take for granted today, those came after in order to justify the racism, which is sort of a different way of thinking about it, like we normally do. Another key point about that is that even though sort of a dominant narrative today remains that race is something biological, that we're born into these racial categories that are sort of neutral and kind of just facts of natural life, what the sociological literature makes very clear is that racism is not biological, right? That's been thoroughly debunked in the sciences. But even though it's not real, what we say is that racism still has a material impact, right? So there's all these ideas in the world outside of race that aren't necessarily real, but that have, you know, considerable impact on people's lives. Race and racism are one of those things, right? So we want to distinguish between race being a socio-political construction and not real in that sense, and then racism still having a material impact on everyone's lives, which we know it does. Another key term I want to emphasize is just this idea of a racial narrative, which has become pretty central in my work. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva at Duke is an important sociologist in this field who's written about this. I've taken it up in some of my work. So I think typically we think about stereotypes, racial, like in this case, racial stereotypes, that kind of are these messages about different groups. And I think, you know, the frame of stereotypes come from kind of the psychological and kind of cognitive psych literature. And I think the framing of there has some value, but I think when we only think about these in terms of stereotypes, we think of those as objects that live in people's heads, rather than stories that we share with each other, right? And that we deploy in social interaction. That's why I tend to use and prefer the term racial narrative instead of racial stereotype, because it describes how these statements about racial groups and also just about race and racism itself aren't just things that live in our heads as cognitive objects, but that we share them in social interaction. And because I've been so interested in how racism is playing out in social interaction, that framing of a racial narrative has been really valuable in my work. So to kind of make this a little more concrete, I want to share one research project that me and my team have been engaged in. So this is a collaboration between myself and colleagues at Michigan State University, both in the physics department and in the Department of Teacher Education there in the College of Ed. And this is a project where we've been collaborating the last couple of years with high school physics teachers in Michigan who are being supported in implementing computational modeling into high school physics. So high school students are learning the traditional physics curriculum, but they're getting a chance to actually use GlowScript to code simulations of traditional physics problems. So you got like hovercrafts flying off cliffs and calculating projectile motion, that kind of thing, except now the kids are actually writing computer code to generate visual models of the hovercraft flying off the cliff and changing parameters, that kind of thing. Now, part of our team's interest in this implementation is that we know that when exciting new curricula like this get implemented and developed, oftentimes it's kids from dominant racial groups who tend to benefit, right? So in this case, and our focus here isn't just on race, but it's also on gender. But our question is, how do social interactions in small groups, as mediated by racial and gender narratives, amplify and attenuate racial and gender inequity? So what actually happens when kids are working in small groups, maybe sharing a laptop, sharing a couple laptops, and they're engaging in this environment? What happens with their social interactions, and who's getting opportunities to learn, and how does that break down along race and gender lines? So one tool that we're using to get a handle on some of the participation patterns that happen in these small groups is a tool that my team has developed called Equip. It's a free web app that you can access at equip.ninja. But we've been using Equip in this context as well as other research studies and other research teams also around the country that have been using Equip as well. And the idea is, how can we get a handle on some of the kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of equity and inequity in social interaction, right? So Equip is a tool you can customize to track patterns of participation. And our sort of assumption is that if teachers and also researchers get access to quantitative analytics on participation patterns, how can you use those to get some insight into how inequity is playing out moment to moment between students? So in this case, teachers we work with in Michigan are getting data back like this, right? So oftentimes they're videotaping small groups of kids in their physics classes working on these computational modeling activities. And based on the video, they're using Equip to code things like, what kinds of participation are happening, like which students are asking questions, who's sort of dominating in terms of the group talk, what is the quality of that talk, these kinds of dimensions of classroom discourse. And Equip is generating these kinds of graphs and charts. And this is becoming fodder for teachers to reflect on how the ways in which they're structuring group work is having an effect on the participation patterns they're playing out. And so the graphs you see here, Equip lets you basically kind of analyze by social marker how participation patterns are playing out. So it's helping teachers to really center race, because we know that when teachers take a frame where they want to support all students and take that kind of for all framing, as opposed to focusing on particular racial markers, issues of race tend to fall by the wayside. So this tool is helping people to really zero in on racial markers and attend to the specific kinds of racial inequities that might be playing out. I want to just close by pointing to a few resources. So the field of computer science education, I've been really excited the last few years by some of the movement. I mean, even just the fact that we're having this panel, I think indicates just the growing interest in the field for, not just equity kind of writ large, but starting to think specifically about race. I've been in math education for a very long time as well. And I think math education, we've kind of taken up this charge a little bit earlier than a lot of other STEM fields. So I think there's a lot that we in computer science education can benefit from. So one key reading I'll point you to is a chapter in the Compendium for Research in Math Education. So this is essentially a handbook that's gotten published just about every 10 years. And in the most recent publication, myself, Danny Martin, and Celia Rousseau Anderson have a chapter in there that basically is synthesizing about 10 to 15 years of research on race, specifically in math education, and just kind of breaking down kind of different approaches scholars in math education have taken. And I think that can be really useful. And then just, also just some scholars' work to follow up on who have done just some really foundational, important work. So Danny Martin at UIC, Naila Nasir, who's at Spencer Foundation right now, Robert Berry at the University of Virginia, and Macy Golston at University of Michigan, all take kind of different angles on this work. So I recommend that you follow up with them.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and participate on this panel. Of course, I wish we were in person, but I'm sort of impressed by our collective ability to still conduct this panel. So my name is Seper Vakil. I'll just start with a short introduction before going into some of my work and some of the resources that I hope to share with you all. I'm an assistant professor in the Learning Sciences program at Northwestern University. My work, similar to Nirul, is kind of broadly situated in STEM education. My own background is in engineering. So I studied electrical engineering and computer science before moving into education. And again, similar to Nirul, I'm sort of circling back to that work in the last few years as I think more about issues of kind of race and science and technology in a broad way. My current work is, as I mentioned, kind of situated between engineering and computer science, but also really interested in the kinds of possibilities that after-school programming provides along these lines. So before I kind of get into some of the texts and ideas and constructs and share about my research, I just want to share two kind of guiding questions that I'd like you to keep in mind as I kind of go through my slides. The first one is how do race and racism, technology, ethics, and power relate to one another? That's a framing question that guides a lot of my work. And then I think it's incumbent upon us to ask, what are the implications for STEM and computer science education? So the first one is more thinking about how as a society, do we understand the relationships between race and racism and technology? And then once we start grappling with those relationships, what does that mean for how we think about organizing learning in formal as well as informal STEM environments? So I wanted to start by bringing people up to speed on my own thinking. Some of this, hopefully you've been exposed to already, but maybe not. So I'm just gonna put out some names and some ideas and some books for people to look into. So the first one is this idea of technological artifacts having politics. And it's by a famous political philosopher and ethicist of technology by the name of Langdon Winner. And so this sort of sits at an interesting debate within technology studies around the relationship between technology and society. And so this article was written as a chapter actually in a collection in the late 80s. And it sort of was a response to the prevailing theory of technological determinism. This idea that sort of science and technology has a mind of its own, so to speak, and develops kind of in a black box, and whatever the outcome of those developments those outcomes will shape society in particular kinds of ways, right? And so this was a very strong challenge to that view, that science and technology just develops on its own and then impacts society, and sort of brings our attention to the role that society has in shaping technology in the first place. But actually, Winter goes even a step beyond that. There's a kind of common understanding among many people who work in technology studies that technologies, computational artifacts, tools are neutral, but have an impact depending on the way that they're wielded in the world. And sort of he actually is forwarding the argument that in the very design of technological artifacts lies an inherent politics. And in my bullet point number 2, there's some more contemporary scholars of technology, Safiya Noble and Ruha Benjamin. They have built on the work of Langdon Winter to kind of talk about and specifically analyze the ways in which race and racism play into that fundamental relationship between technology and society. So the book Algorithms of Oppression has made a big splash in the technology studies kind of public and scholarly discourse, and it's a study of the ways in which search engines kind of reinforce bias. And Ruha Benjamin's book, The New Jim Crow, also picks up that theme of the way in which algorithms and codes can actually encode societal bias in really powerful ways. And of course, the New Jim, that's actually a misspelling. It should be the New Jim Code, and it's a play off of the New Jim Crow, which is of course Michelle Alexander's very impactful book looking at the system of mass incarceration in the last 30, 40 years, and how it's effectively reproducing many of the systems of racialized domination that started in the era of Jim Crow after the Civil War. So kind of transitioning into the kind of land and world of computer science and engineering education, there's been a really important kind of discussion on the role of ethics, and how do we think about, how do we teach students both at the K through 12 but also at the undergraduate level about kind of issues of right and wrong. And this dichotomy between micro and macro ethics, forwarded by engineering education scholar Joseph Herkert, was really one of the first times that there was a collective conversation about the ways in which ethics is often treated as the domain of individual decisions in the way that we do engineering and computer science education. And whether that means like cyberbullying or pirating of certain software online, or the individual decisions of engineers when they're working in the context of industry. That's sort of a microethical approach, which he contrasts with a macroethical approach, which is more in line with the way that Safiya Noble and Ruha Benjamin and Langdon Winter think about the relationship between technology and society in a more holistic manner, and kind of looking at the relationship between technology and inequality, and the responsibilities that not just individual engineers or computer scientists have as they go about their daily work, but what is the responsibility of the discipline of computer science? That's the kind of question that comes to the surface when we think about macroethics. In some of my own work, I've been looking very closely at racial identity as it intersects with the way that the computer science and technical fields of study are presented to students, and also kind of developing this idea of political identity. So I'll just say a tiny bit about that. I have a new piece that explores this a little bit further, but essentially one of the things that I've learned in my years working with high school students in computer science classrooms, when I was in the Bay Area doing my dissertation work at UC Berkeley, I did a lot of work in the Oakland Unified School District. And for those of you who might be familiar with that sort of landscape, you know that there's a really robust discussion of a critique of the role of the technology industry in processes of gentrification and displacement that are pushing out low-income communities of color further and further outside of cities like Oakland and Berkeley and San Francisco. And so one thing that was really interesting in my work with high school students in a computer science class in Oakland was that those ideas around the role that technology companies are playing writ large in their communities didn't suddenly, become muted when they stepped into the domain of a computer science class, especially when computer science education in many places like Oakland are happening in kind of deep partnership with the technology industry, right? And so one thing that was really interesting to learn was that many students were asking really critical questions about why or to what extent those companies were influencing and shaping the character of computer science. And so that kind of leads me to this idea of a political identity that's important to take into account when we are when we're expanding CS learning opportunities, to think about how is this going to matter for students? How do young people, in particular youth of color, make sense out of the larger purposes and ethics of CS? These aren't questions that we typically center in CS education at the high school or at the undergraduate level, but I think there's an important movement towards engaging those topics. So I've been trying to pick up some of these themes and threads in my own work since moving to the Chicago area. I'm going to talk about the Young People's Race, Power, and Technology program. Briefly, this is an after-school program in partnership with 2 high schools, a community center, and also a community-based organization in the Chicago area that focuses on surveillance and community rights. Chicago has been in the spotlight for being one of the most surveilled cities in the U.S. And so the Young People's Race, Power, and Technology project essentially takes this up with youth and presents them with the opportunity to kind of explore the way technology is shaping their communities and their neighborhoods. There's kind of a lot of moving parts to this after school program, and we're right in the middle of it right now. That essentially youth are collaborating with undergraduate students at Northwestern University. Some of those students are computer science students who know a lot about the technology. Some of the students are sociology students who are from Chicago and have a sense of what's going on the ground in different neighborhoods in the city. And there's also an arts documentary film component. So we are kind of empowering the students to learn about the technologies that are shaping their communities, and they're ultimately telling stories about them through the medium of documentary film. The goal is really to approach the learning of technology from a different angle than by starting with coding or other kind of more traditional methods, and saying there is something powerful about kind of nerding out on different technologies, like facial recognition technologies, for example, is a big topic of interest in the city. Or there's something called a gang database in the Chicago area that's gained a lot of attention. And so we want young people to, go under the hood of these technologies and learn about them, and to develop a technological sensibility at the same time as they are developing an ability to, speak in sophisticated ways about the ways that these technologies are kind of influencing their local contexts. So here's some pictures of the youth kind of doing various aspects. They're out in the community in the summertime as weather permits in the Chicago area, exploring different ways that technology shows up around them, just kind of training them to think about and see technology. And then there's a lot of work. Right now, we're in the middle of the documentary editing process. So there's 3 films that students are making. One is about facial recognition. One is about the gang database. And the third one is about ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the different technologies that local groups are using to combat ICE raids in various neighborhoods in the city. So I'll stop there, and if there's time at the end to kind of to talk more about this, for those of you who are interested, I'd be happy to kind of share more about where I see this work going. Thank you.
So hello, my name is Allison Scott. I'm the Chief Research Officer at the K4 Center based in Oakland, California, and excited to be here today participating on this panel to talk a little bit about researching race in computer science education. So my remarks are going to center around the centrality of race and examining trends in access, enrollment, and equity in computer science, specifically in California. My background, I'm a social science researcher by training, and my background is in understanding and in examining inequality in education. And a personal passion and focus of my work for the past 6+ years has been on K-12 computer science education, thinking deeply and examining trends around who has access and the opportunity to develop knowledge and skills in this critical subject, and more importantly, who does not have this access. So in this community, we know we've seen increased attention to computer science education across the nation for the past several years, ranging from large industry investments, the CS for All movement, and pretty significant state level policy changes. So we had a really basic question. We wanted to understand and examine whether this increased attention has positively impacted the students with the least access and opportunity. And that would be low-income students and students of color. So we approached this research by centering race and by asking some specific research questions. We then translated the questions into the ways that we analyzed the data and then reported the findings. And more importantly, there were some things that we did not do. We did not focus on global trends, total numbers of students, total numbers of courses, overall passage rates, because we knew that would hide the very critical gaps in equity. We also did not report on high-level findings without granularity. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about how some of the most interesting and compelling findings were uncovered by looking at intersections in data. So again, the focus was on examining trends in access, equity, and enrollment in computer science in California. And we looked at disparities by race, by gender, by race and gender, socioeconomic status. And we wanted to understand the explanatory factors for existing disparities, and then also how this data might inform race-conscious solutions. So this research was grounded in some key frameworks to help us both understand inequality and to articulate ways to analyze the data. So first, structural inequality. This research was situated within the context of economic, educational, and social policies and practices, which have historically led to the disproportionate access to education, housing, employment, wealth, healthcare, and physical environments for communities of color, which we think is a really important place to start this conversation. And then within education, this research builds upon the important work of Linda Darling-Hammond, Jeannie Oakes, Jane Margolis, and work from the Education Trust and UCLA Harvard Civil Rights Project, which all talk about the disparities in school funding, teacher quality, tracking access to CS courses, access to AP courses, and disproportionate disciplinary practices. The second framework that we incorporated into this analysis was intersectionality, which is a framework developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was really critical to this work and actually to all of our work in CS education. So intersectionality contextualizes identity related to the structures of power and the intersection of racism and sexism that affects women of color in ways that can't be fully examined or captured by looking at just race or just gender. And Crenshaw would argue that without identifying the specific challenges that are facing women of color in the computing pipeline, any interventions made will be exclusionary, insufficient, and ineffective. So those were our two grounding frameworks. And then the two terms that the two concepts that we use to examine and analyze our data, which are helpful to just point out and define a little bit more, were underrepresentation. So we defined underrepresentation as the comparison between the participation rates of racial, ethnic, or gender groups in a domain, CS enrollment, for example, relative to the proportion of that subgroup in the larger population. So in this analysis, we defined underrepresentation as participation in CS versus overall participation of that subgroup in K-12 education. And it's important to note that underrepresentation varies across contexts, and it's necessary to specify the domain in which we are analyzing and categorizing underrepresentation. So again, in this context, we're talking about K-12 education. And then finally, equity gaps were a major component of our analysis, where we defined equity gaps as significant disparities between subgroups on a specific variable. So we wanted to be very clear about which variables we would examine. So like access to courses, enrollment, AP passage rates, and then comparing subgroups, for example, high socioeconomic status to low socioeconomic status, different racial groups, rural versus urban, and county analyses. So just a little bit about our research methods. We looked at quantitative school level data obtained from the California Department of Education. We looked at 5 years of trends in the data. And then again, we looked at very specific metrics like availability of courses by county, by income, by racial group, enrollment in CS, by type of course, by gender, race, county. We looked at success rates, so the passage rates in APCS, again, by race and gender. And then again, we looked at equity gaps, which were the differences between gender and racial groups and the gaps in representation relative to the population. So this is a whole lot about the methods, which I think are important to consider. And now I'll talk a little bit about just some highlights of our findings that'll demonstrate why it's so important to have clear definitions, clear frameworks, and clear analyses protocols. So in terms of access to CS courses, if we just looked at top level data, we would see a positive trend line in the number of courses offered across the state of California. So we're seeing increases in all of the courses. That's a good sign. But as soon as you cut the access data by the type of school, you'll see significant equity gaps in access to computer science courses by school demographics, which negatively impact the opportunity that low-income students and students of color have to participate in CS education. So our data show that high URM schools are 2 times less likely to offer any computer science courses and 3 times less likely to offer AP courses. The same thing is true for low-income schools. And we also found disparities by county. So without analyzing the county level data, we wouldn't have clear indications of different regional impacts and the impacts on rural students as well. Okay, so when we added another variable into the analysis, which was time, we found some important and critical results. The gaps in access to CS courses actually increased for the schools that were serving primarily students of color. So you'll see the gap increase to 33 percentage points between schools with the highest number of students of color and schools with the lowest percentage of students of color. So this tells us that the increased attention and focus on computer science across government, industry, the policy changes at the state level, and pilot project implementation in local communities has not improved access for underrepresented students of color and actually has widened gaps. So this next slide talks a little bit about the enrollment trends that we saw in California over the past 5 years. So we saw that overall enrollment increased significantly, and that's on a separate data point that I didn't include here for the purposes of understanding that that is not the full story. So in terms of the raw numbers, if you look at the blue line, you can see that for Latinx students, there's been some promising growth in AP CS participation since 2014, especially with the launch of the new AP CS course. So Asian students are still the highest, white students and Latinx students are roughly the same. However, it's important to note that looking at the underrepresentation is really critical in this slide. So Latinx students are still drastically underrepresented relative to their population. So we know that Latinx students make up 53% of the California high school population and just 15% of AP students in AP computer science. And then also down at the bottom for Black students, you can see that the trend line is not increasing at the same rate of other students, and Black students are still significantly underrepresented relative to their overall population. And even these 2 slides didn't tell the complete story. I talked about the framework of intersectionality in Kimberly Crenshaw's work. When we looked at APCS participation by race and gender, Black girls and Latinx girls were significantly underrepresented. And in terms of raw numbers, just 39 Black girls and 453 Latinx girls took AP Computer Science A in 2018. So I'd like to close with just a few considerations. The first that was mentioned by a few of my colleagues already is that we know that there are limitations to an all approach, both in our strategy and in our implementation. It's discussed a lot, but we see it clearly play out in computer science education, and we've seen it play out in this data. So taking an all approach benefits those who already have advantages, but I would argue that we have a really great opportunity to take a different approach and prioritize our resources, our programs, and our policies to target the areas where there are the greatest needs. And I think that's the way that we will begin to see equity gaps closing. And then in our CS education work, I think it's critical for all of us to ask ourselves very important questions about the data. As I talked a little bit about, if we talk just at the highest level of overall trends, we're missing really important information that'll tell us where we should target our efforts and our resources. So how we are collecting data, how we choose to disaggregate or analyze the data. Again, the example of intersectionality, are we looking at race and gender? Are we just talking about gender? And how are we going to hold ourselves accountable and our school systems accountable for closing the gaps? So it's going to be a lot easier to say we saw an increase in the number of courses overall, but is that ultimately getting us to the goal of closing equity gaps for students of color and underrepresented students? And then finally, I would just argue that that as we approach these challenges, that there are opportunities for multiple levels of impact. So instead of just thinking about one target place, like let's change state level policy or let's get more courses in schools, I would argue that a comprehensive approach is needed, and there are some really powerful things that can be done at all levels while taking into account these critical frameworks for understanding and addressing equity in computer science. So thank you for listening and participating.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and it is so exciting to be on this panel today. I will be building on the comments of some of my esteemed colleagues and talking about researching race in computer science education and thinking about demystifying some key vocabulary as well as some research methods to think about studying race and how it actually plays out in terms of data collection and so forth. So for the context of today's example, I'd like to share with you a research study about studying race within the context of teacher education. And I think it's important to understand that this study is contextualized within understanding how race and racism operates in the larger ecosystem of education, K-12 education, and computer science education, as we've just heard about. In this particular example, I'd like to share, based on research I've done along with some of my graduate students, Stephanie Johnson, Ali Ivy, Max Gordinsky, and Jimmy Snyder. And we explored in a teacher professional development setting how teachers understand and talk about race in a professional learning context. And we also thought, how do teachers learn about race, gender, and equity in the context of computer science education? We brought a series of knowledge to these questions. I was a former computer science teacher at a very diverse high school, and I myself had challenges recruiting and retaining students of color in particular, as well as girls in the computer science classroom, and wondering about what is the role of teachers, what is the role of curriculum, and how can we think about broadening participation systematically. My research colleagues also came with a variety of teaching experience and grassroots organizing experience in communities, which really helped us form relationships and get under some of the data that was required to answer these questions. So for our research methods, we thought about using pre and post professional development teacher surveys. These were mostly quantitative with a few qualitative items. And this was done before and after an Exploring Computer Science Professional Development workshop. And about 100 teachers answered these pre and post PD surveys, so we could think about learning over the course of the week of professional development. We also took detailed field notes from inside the classrooms, 4 different classrooms in a professional development workshop. So we could think about both the similarities between these 4 different settings running the same professional development curriculum, as well as maybe some unique incidents or conversations that took place in each classroom. And then lastly, to learn a little bit more outside of what was happening within the professional development workshop time period, we also conducted interviews with teachers to examine how they were experiencing the professional development and their own understandings around race, racism, gender, sexism, and computer science education in particular. We had a few data sources that I'll share here just to give you a sense of the type of data we collected and how we thought about analyzing it. So we had one white woman in the professional development workshop talking about a cornrow curves activity that's part of the Exploring Computer Science lesson. And she was reflecting on her decision to basically skip this lesson, just go to the next lesson in the curriculum. And she noted that she skipped this lesson, as she said, because I have to skip and choose or else I'll run out of time. But I thought about it and I don't have an answer to this. I skipped this one and not others. And in my mind, why did I think this one and not the others? And she went on to say, I don't really have an excuse other than time, but why did, again, she choose to cut this and maybe robotics when having a time constraint? So that was an example of one type of data we collected. And then, of course, we also had other people who brought different experiences and insights to what it means to teach race in the curriculum in particular. And this teacher, an African-American man, said, well, white kids taking home questions about cornrows and African-American history, there might be a repulsive or indifferent response from parents. So he was less worried about his capacity to teach it and how he was interacting with this lesson, and more about how it might be received in his context in the place that he was teaching at his school site. So these types of data led us to think about an analysis using colorblind discourse. So thinking about how race and racism was being talked about and operated, often without actually being explicitly talked about. So for example, we often saw teachers evading lessons or conversations about race, or we saw them individualizing these decisions about patterns and participation by individuality, or often we would just see or hear the deafening sound of silence, as we learned to term it, where people would just not necessarily talk about race when these conversations came up. And then we also saw more race-conscious discourse taking place, as you could see in some of these examples, particularly around more veteran or seasoned teachers coming back for their second year of professional development, and often from teachers of color as well. And the race-conscious discourse was about talking much more explicitly about discrimination, structural biases, and also about students' assets and culturally responsive ways to teach computing, given their knowledge about students and student communities. We also discovered that these conversations that were more race conscious did not just operate randomly. In fact, they tended to happen when lessons in the professional development were centered explicitly on race. So for example, that cornrows lesson in which teachers were practicing teaching about cornrows led to the discussion that we just shared. And without having the content of the professional development itself to be about race, these conversations did not always percolate. Lastly, we also saw that as teachers became more knowledgeable and more skilled at having discourse around race and computer science and how it matters in the ecosystem of equity-based instruction, they also started claiming a certain teacher agency that went beyond the boundaries of their classroom, not only about recruiting and retaining students of color, but also about working with counselors, working with other teachers, working with student groups, and being much more intentional about teaching for equity as part of their identity as computer science educators. A second major research finding that came out of this study builds nicely along the work that we just heard about from Allison. And this was about women of color teachers and how they really brought in a unique feminist standpoint perspective around equity in CS. They could talk about what it meant to be a woman of color and identify with girls who were maybe experiencing sexism or environments that were not welcoming. And they could also talk about their experiences and mentoring as people of color for their students of color. And of course, being able to reach, in particular, girls of color as important role models and important intersectional, important in terms of sharing an intersectional identity. And these teachers all talked about their large commitment to communities and their commitment to teach in particular communities rather than a commitment to teach a particular subject such as computer science. And these teachers also held on to a really important concept of having a critical hope for their work in broadening participation in computing. They didn't want to stay at the gap gazing place of looking at disparities. They wanted to talk about particular strategies or decisions that they felt would directly impact students of color in particular in accessing more culturally responsive ways of thinking or of experiencing computer science. And so given these findings, we found that to systemically broaden participation in computing, it was really important to intentionally recruit and retain more teachers of color, particularly more women teachers of color, to teach computer science. And so lastly, some recommendations from experiences in studying race. One was the utility of theory to connect methodology, findings, and implications to more generalizable knowledge so that others can connect to. So hoping that even though this particular research took place in an exploring computer science professional development, certainly the findings are generalizable to other professional development settings that are attending to race and equity in education. Also, we found that it was very helpful in sort of rejecting the strictly categorical racial categories. Of course, this is more challenging to do in quantitative studies, but thinking about allowing participants to self-identify, particularly for qualitative studies, allowed the multiple dimensions of race and ethnicity and identity to emerge in more situated ways. And we also suggest that these sort of intersectional dimensions be captured again, much as Allison Scott just talked about. So we're not only studying categories of gender or of race or ability or SES, but really attending to those in the multi-layered ways they occur in real life, so that we can see a less obscure version of experiences of these folks. And then lastly, qualitative and mixed method studies are needed in education, but in computer science education in particular, to help elevate some of these experiences and to ultimately be able to use data to make conclusions and offer recommendations that will have implications to create a more anti-racist pathway to computer science education. And I think it's really important to conduct these studies and think about the research questions so that when the data is collected and analyzed and presented, that there are real life, both classroom level, school level, policy level implications that further our shared commitment to equity and anti-racism and education. So thank you for your attention, and that concludes my portion.
And with that, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I really appreciate the work and preparation of my colleagues who presented here. I hope you learned a ton. Thank you very much for coming.